Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Uprising 313. On December 17th, 2010, Mohamed Bouazizi, a popular young man and street vendor in the town of Sidi Bouzid in rural Tunisia, doused himself in gasoline and set himself on fire to protest the police harassment, humiliation, corruption, and authoritarianism that made it impossible for him to make even a meager living. His act of self-immolation became something of a catalyst for the Tunisian revolution, which 28 days later brought down President Ben Ali after 23 years in power. The nonviolent occupation of Tahrir Square began a little over a month later, on January 25th, 2011. And during the 18 days of upheaval in Cairo and around Egypt, over 800 persons were killed and thousands, about 6,400, injured, following lengthy violent street battles with the forces of order and disorder. Less than a year into the Arab Spring, by November 2011, the UN and other human rights groups had estimated that there were as many as 30,000 deaths in Libya, 3,500 Syrian casualties from, at the time, peaceful protests. That was before the civil war and the destruction of the entire country. About 300 killed in Tunisia, about 250 casualties in Yemen, 30 deaths by government forces in Bahrain by November 2011. Now, I wanted to start there with these sacrifices for justice to emphasize the courage of protest, here predominantly nonviolent protest, the courage especially in authoritarian regimes. I was brutally reminded of that in reading Soha Bayoumi's essay for today and this passage which she had in epigraph. You are not going out to make a revolution and live. You are going out to make a revolution and die for your siblings, for your children, for anyone, so that others can enjoy this beautiful thing. This was said by 20-year-old Mina Daniel, who was later killed in Cairo in October 2011 during an attack by the Egyptian military against a peaceful Coptic protest in Maspero near Tahrir Square. The stakes of justice are indeed high. As you know, today we move from the past to the present, hoping to approach the present through its history. After exploring the modern concept of revolution that inaugurated the idea of social revolutions, of revolutions not just from a political but for social change that we studied with Etienne Balibar, Simona Forti, and Gayatri Spivak, and then pushing forward through Mao to Maoist-inspired insurrections and insurgencies, from the model of anti-colonial uprisings through the mode of insurrectional separatism of the Invisible Committee, which we explored last time with Claire Fontaine, Claudia Pozzana, and Alessandro Russo. Today, we begin our exploration of a more contemporary uprising and ask, as directly as possible, these animating questions. Whether or how the uprisings of the Arab Spring represent a new paradigm or different modality of revolt? Can we even speak of the Arab Spring, or were there many different types of uprisings? And what kind of uprisings was it, or were they? How did they relate to other kinds of uprisings we have already studied, the modern revolution, the insurgency, the insurrection? And all this, of course, without turning our inquiry into just a question of categorization, right? Or an exercise in creating categories, but rather of creating histories, contextualization, and critical theorizing. The words we use, the frames we deploy, matter, as Koselleck reminded us in that last sentence of his essay. Now, we have been deploying a range of concepts to talk about the Arab Spring, and I tried to list a number of them in the Reader's Companion: uprising, revolts, upheavals, commotions, insurrectionary energies, revolution, revolutionary episodes, reformism, even revolutions, a term of Asef Bayat, which is a mixture of revolutionary mobilization and reformist trajectories. But how should we then, what works? And can we assess these uprisings today still? Do we assess them by their outcomes? Can we interpret them in their immediacy when we still are unclear as to where they will really lead us? Is it even possible to assess these uprisings in themselves, in isolation from their subsequent historical developments? So these are the questions we're here to address, and we're fortunate to have with us several brilliant scholars to begin the conversation. Now, as you know, Tariq Ali was going to begin the conversation this evening, but because of a health issue, he's unable to join us, though I can share that he's recovering well. Now, rather than introduce him first, I just wanted to briefly put on the table the perspective that I think Tariq Ali would have brought, which was a specific kind of perspective for the conversation. In the context of the Arab Spring of 2011, Tariq would pointed us to earlier, more radical threads of revolutionary thought and practice. When we asked him originally for readings for today, readings on the Arab Spring, he immediately responded, and this was what he wrote. "We'll have to think. Lenin's April thesis immediately comes to mind." Now, why the April theses? Well, reading from his most recent book, The Dilemmas of Lenin, Terrorism, War, Empire, Love, Revolution, which just came out with Verso 2017, and which is outside with Book Culture, and also from his essay, Between Past and Future, I think it becomes clear. Tariq Ali argues that the entire trajectory of Middle Eastern politics, from the lengthy rule of autocrats over the past decades to the rapid fall of Gaddafi, Ben Ali, Mubarak, and the invasion of Iraq, are all determined primarily shaped by US interests, specifically, what he says, the intertwining logics of Washington's jealous guardianship of the region's oil and Israel's grip over its Middle Eastern policy. The real politics at stake, in Ali's terms, are then US interests, and they shape both the challenge and also the solutions, in a sense. Lenin's April theses, as you know, were originally pronounced by Lenin after the first Russian Revolution and before the Bolshevik Revolution of October. They were a clarion call to action at a time when the Bolshevik leadership was adrift. And at the time, Lenin called on his party members to unleash a second uprising, a term that would have a special resonance, possibly, for Egypt in 2011. What Lenin wrote was, "The specific features of the present situation in Russia is that the country is passing from the first stage of the revolution, which, owing to the insufficient class consciousness and organization of the proletariat, placed power in the hands of the bourgeoisie, to its second stage, which must place power in the hands of the proletariat and the poorest sections of the peasants." Now, these words, Tariq Ali notes, paved the way for the revolution of October 1917. They paved the way for a very different kind of vanguardist revolution that was consciously avoided by many in Tahrir Square and later in Zuccotti Park. The contrast really couldn't be sharper. And the message, I think, is clear. What was needed at Tahrir Square, or Occupy Wall Street, or in the squares and streets of Indignados, Spain, was a second revolution. And all of these events need to be placed in the larger context of anti-imperialism. That alone would have produced lasting change. And I'm not sure who here will take up the Tariq Ali's position tonight and continue to bring it on the table, but I wanted to stake it out for us first, and if necessary, I'll defend it for Tariq. Now, our next guest then is Soha Bayoumi, who joins us from Harvard University and the History of Science Department, where she teaches and researches about health and social justice, biomedical ethics, and the links between medicine and politics. She has worked and taught on European and American intellectual history, as well as the intellectual history of the modern and contemporary Middle East. She also works on questions related to gender, health, and medicine. Her book, Doctors of the Revolution, Health and Social Justice Activism in Egypt, which is forthcoming at Stanford, and co-authored with Shireen Hamdi, analyzes the tension between doctors' commitment to an allegedly transcendental neutrality and the daily demands of the Tahrir Square uprising. Among other tensions, the book discusses how these doctors' commitment to professional ethics puts them at odds with the orders of military personnel, rendering their appeal to medical neutrality a weighty political act in and of itself. And she's working on a second book project currently entitled A Noble Profession, Doctors and Their Social Roles in Contemporary Egypt. After Soha, Nada Moumtaz will speak, and she's a professor in the Department of the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto. Her work stands at the intersection of Islamic legal studies, the anthropology of Islam, and studies of capitalism, and spans the 19th and 21st centuries in the Levant. She is currently finishing her book manuscript, which is tentatively entitled Reviving the Waqf, Property, Law, and Religion in Modern Beirut, where she examines the contemporary Islamic revival of a century-old charitable practice of pious endowment under global capitalism and a regime of modern nation-states. She argues that these attempts to rekindle the practice of waqf reorder key concepts in the Islamic tradition, namely public benefit, family, and intent. And in her previous published work, Nada probes the qualitative change in the anthropological study of Islam from a confining focus on Islam as a religion to the contemporary focus on analyzing long-standing ethical debates about the way to best live one's life as a Muslim, whether in praying, fasting, driving, traveling, or simply being. After their presentations, our own Safwan Masri will comment and open the discussion. We're delighted to receive Safwan, especially in light of the very recent publication of his book, Tunisia, an Arab Anomaly, which just came out a couple of weeks ago and is also here with Book Culture, and which couldn't be more on point with our seminar today. As you know, Safwan Masri is Executive Vice President of Global Centers and Global Development here at Columbia University. And in this role, he's responsible for the development of expanding network of global centers located in Amman, Tunis, Istanbul, Mumbai, Nairobi, Beijing, Paris, Rio de Janeiro, and Santiago. So an expanding reach of the global centers and global Columbia. Safwan is on the faculty of the Columbia Business School and previously taught at Stanford University, a scholar on education and contemporary geopolitics and society in the Arab world. Safwan's work focuses on understanding the historic post-colonial dynamics of religion, education, society, and politics. And as you will hear today, he has a very penetrating analysis of the success of the Tunisian revolution. I'll then moderate with Jesus overseeing and guiding me since he's going to be on sabbatical in a few weeks. And so I need to get trained. I do want to welcome a few other persons, though. Especially, I want to welcome Musab Zaytun, who's here, a graduate student at SIPA, who was having very great difficulties getting to New York and getting to Columbia. A dual national, UK and Libyan. His visa, although he had a perfectly live and functional B1 visa, so was entirely eligible to enter the country, his J1 visa mysteriously entered into administrative processing, which would have been a process that could have taken anywhere between 90 days, 6 months, and a year, which of course makes it difficult to get to orientation for orientation week. So a group of students at the law school and I were fortunate enough to get a call from Musab, and we helped pave the way to a visa and to his presence here. And so and most importantly, Musab has spent the last 4 years at the Libyan Central Bank, where he has been working and where he headed the compliance unit at the Libyan Central Bank. And they had a program where you can kind of apply to go do a master's at a top 20 school if you can get in, and Musab did. And so we're extraordinarily thrilled to have him here, but also to have his perspective, because he particularly moved to Libya right after the fall of Gaddafi to participate in kind of the rebuilding of the country. So it's wonderful to have you here, Musab. And then, of course, it's also wonderful to have in the room all of our great students and faculty and friends, Etienne Balibar, Aurélie Violette, Thomas Dodman, Rosalind Morris, Nadia Urbinati, Lydia Liu joins us tonight, Daniele Lorenzini, Reinhold Martin, Neni Panugia, and others. So thank you so much, and a special thanks to Anna Krauthammer for making this all happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me here. I apologize for having my laptop open. I didn't get a chance to print out my notes. We've been instructed by Bernard not to read or dwell on the posts that we already posted on the website, and so I'm not doing this. Believe me. I wanted, though, to elaborate on a few points that I made in those notes and expand on some of them, and basically as the interface with some of the other points that were brought up in some of the other posts and readings for this session. One thing that I discuss is this idea of trying to study, thinking about studying non-traditional actors, right, when it comes to the Arab Spring. And so I talk about my own work with Shireen Hamdi, studying the role of physicians in the Egyptian uprising in particular. And of course, you know, there are different reasons for doing something like this, for a scholarly engagement of that sort. One is the idea of, for me, for instance, as a science and technology studies, you know, student, and as someone who's studying the history of medicine and the production of medical knowledge and the deployment of medical expertise in different political contexts, there is this idea of how medical knowledge gets to be produced, how medical expertise gets to interface with different other forms of expertise in a very tumultuous political context, like the Egyptian uprising as an example of that. But it's not only that. I think that when people ask me why doctors, I think that there are many interesting ways of looking at or studying non-traditional actors in the Arab Spring. You look at the role of journalists, for example, and the idea of journalistic neutrality and what that means, you know, for journalists to cover violent political events, especially when we're talking about you know, Egyptian you know, journalists covering the Egyptian revolution, for instance, or Tunisian journalists covering the Tunisian revolution, what it means for them to be in the midst of those political events, sometimes the explicit target of political violence, despite all international conventions around the protection of the press or the protection of medical personnel, as in the case of doctors and things like that. So there is an interest in looking at different forms of expertise and how they are deployed in volatile political contexts, and we may learn a lot about how those are you know, deployed in such you know, tumultuous contexts. Second, I think there is, and this is a point that I refer to briefly in my remarks, in my written remarks, this idea of trying to take seriously the notion of studying the political economy of the uprisings in the Arab Spring. You know, when we talk about, you know, scholars usually talk about the fact that there was a confluence of factors that led or fomented the uprisings in 2011, that started in 2011 in the Arab region. You know, people talk about, you know, political factors, they talk about economic factors. And one thing that I think is interesting when looking, for instance, at the role that was played by socioeconomic demands in the Egyptian uprising in particular, which is the case that I'm studying, is how those demands were shaped in the minds of the people who were calling for them, and the fact that the separation between political and economic demands is an arbitrary one in many cases. Analytically, because because when people talk about neoliberalism and neoliberal policies, those are they are economic policies, but that were shaped by specific political choices that were made on the part of the ruling political elites in those countries. And for my interests, ethnographically, in the minds of the protesters and the minds of the physicians who took to the streets in various forms during those years to demand, human dignity, karama insaniya, but they demanded specifically, better health, a better health system, universal health care coverage, and they were out against the privatization and the neoliberalization of the health system in Egypt. So I think that provides us with an interesting vantage point to examine some of those, the interaction of some of those factors, political and economic factors in the uprising. And the third point that I also allude to in my written remarks is the possibility of hope. And it's very difficult to talk about hope in such a drastic political context in the Arab region, particularly Egypt, according to many, has fared even better than some of its neighbors like Libya or Syria. But Egypt represents a very bleak image of the restoration, of military rule and the police and a brutal police state, a reconsolidation of authoritarianism, even worse than under Mubarak, with more than 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt, languishing in Sisi's prisons, even though he has the audacity while meeting with Macron to say that there are no political prisoners in Egypt. When it comes to looking at non-traditional actors, and by non-traditional actors I mean to focus on actors other than the military, the Muslim Brotherhood, the established political parties, etc. So from my perspective, from my examination of the role of doctors, for instance, it was very interesting for me to look at how doctors were able over the last few years, even with the reconsolidation of authoritarianism, to carve out a space for political action in a political context that has been, in a public sphere that has been all but foreclosed. I would argue has been actually completely foreclosed by the current regime. And so, with the draconian anti-protest law that was passed, for instance, in Egypt in 2013, following the Rabaa massacre, the Rabaa and Nahda massacres against the members of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the crackdown on activists, on journalists, on academics, on human rights workers, etc. Doctors were able to, independent doctors who claimed an apolitical ethos, a professional ethos, right, for their demands, were able to stage two of the major strikes in Egyptian history. In 2012, before under Morsi's rule, and in 2014 under Sisi's rule, or after, at least after well, actually it was under Sisi's rule in October 2014, so that was after a few months after he took office. Each strike lasted for over 3 months. Doctors were present. They were providing free care in the emergency rooms in all the public hospitals in Egypt, but they refrained from taking any money from patients, any fees, hospital fees, for any services provided. And that was, a representative of the ideal that many physicians espoused in that movement, or non-movement, as Asif Bayat would call it, and I might get to that later if I have a minute, or maybe in the Q&A we can do that. The belief that was espoused by many of those physicians was that medical care or health care in public hospitals needed to be provided for free of charge for everyone, right? And so they staffed the ERs, they were there, for 3 months, they provided care, they defied a police apparatus, a humongous police apparatus, a mighty police and military apparatus, to occupy the ERs in all public hospitals around Egypt and to provide care free of charge for everyone, and to neutralize the patients, if anything, they wanted to explain to the patients that they are on their side and that the enemy is the state and its crumbling healthcare system that is unjust both to the physicians and to the patients. And so they coupled their professional demands, those doctors coupled their professional demands with social justice demands for better health care for everyone, universal health care coverage, and demands against the privatization of the healthcare system and the unethical practices by some pharmaceutical companies in Egypt. This brings me to going back to the notion of hope, which is the third point that I wanted to emphasize here. There are lots of reasons to despair, right? When it comes to examining a country like Egypt and its current political situation. One of them is actually, even from my angle, is the brain drain of doctors. According to some estimates, 60% of Egyptian doctors work abroad now, either in Europe or the United States or in Gulf countries. There is crackdown also on them, and they are being targeted by the police state for a variety of reasons. I mentioned briefly in my written remarks, I referenced an incident that happened last year in January, February 2016, when 2 doctors in the ER in one of Egypt's most populous areas, a hospital that serves one of the most populous areas in Egypt, and one of the poorest ones as well. Those 2 doctors were attacked by policemen actually, they were not officers, who wanted one of the doctors to fabricate a police report exaggerating one of those officers or one of those policemen's injuries in order to accuse a random person who happened to be in police custody of battery or of attacking that policeman. And so when the doctor refused to do that, invoking his medical ethics, the policeman brought a number of other policemen and beat them up, beat all the doctors in the ER up. And so the doctors closed the hospital down, occupied the ER, and said that they were not going to work until those police officers and the policemen and the police officers were brought to justice. The Egyptian Medical Syndicate, which is now run by a group of people, a group of physicians who have been active since 2007, rallying for the rights of physicians, for better working conditions, better salaries, better compensation, training opportunities, but also for health justice. They called for an extraordinary General Assembly of the Medical Syndicate, to which 10,000 doctors showed up from all over the country. And of course, they did not expect as many people to show up, and so people overflowed into the streets about 3 minutes away from Tahrir Square. This is where the general headquarters of the Egyptian Medical Syndicate is, and they chanted last year against the Ministry of Interior, the police, and the military. and against the impunity of those bodies. And finally, the policemen were brought to justice. Charges were pressed against them. And despite, of course, attempts by the political elites including members of the parliament, for instance, to contain the situation and to call for reconciliation and things like that. The fact that the medical syndicate, the elections in the medical syndicate that happened in 2011, 2015, 2015, and most recently, earlier this month in October 2017, were won by a majority of independent physicians who have been rallying since 2007 for better healthcare for Egyptians, against the privatization of the healthcare system, for better rights, better working conditions and training opportunities and compensation for physicians, and against a police state. The fact that they were able to win those elections, I think, is reason for hope. The fact that they were embattled by a very well-funded, state-sponsored, list of doctors, and one swept the elections actually in 2015 and 2017, I think is cause for pause, not necessarily for celebration, but for pause to understand how this is happening, why this is happening, and whether there is value in thinking about the concept of non-movements that Fayette in his work talks about, this idea of assemblages of citizens who, in their different capacities, may invoke political or apolitical, sometimes, logics that are emancipatory, and progressive in many ways, whether they are physicians working, calling for better, for health reform, or journalists, or engineers, or lawyers, or garbage collectors, or young people in their universities. I think there is interest for us to go back to some of those views. That Fayette published his book on the politics of life, about Egypt and the rest of the Middle East, and understanding so non-movements, if you will, or how ordinary people make politics in the Middle East, only a few months before the Egyptian uprising of 2011 and the Tunisian uprising of before it. But I think the fact that we see this inspiration of hope in 2011, and then some would argue the death of that hope a couple of years later, makes me think that there is value in digging deeper and thinking about what is left of those revolutions, uprisings, revolutions, however we want to call them, right? And to see value in thinking about ordinary people in extraordinary contexts, everyday politics, and social non-movements, if you will, as a prism for this.
Great. Thank you so much for that kind of focus
on thank you for having me, and I am disobedient, so I am not going to do my remarks as requested. My intervention today revolves around a puzzle triggered by the Syrian revolution. Why have some of the most radical and progressive intellectuals on the left and the West failed to recognize the revolutionary character of the Syrian uprising and the urgency of ending Assad's violent repression? An important key to this conundrum, I would like to suggest, might lie in the affective register. Sorry. Yeah, got it. An An important key to this conundrum, I would like to suggest, might lie in the affective register. Our sensibilities and affects, our attachments to particular authoritative accounts of revolution and of leftist anti-imperialism might blind us to the revolutionary character of that uprising. Bringing an awareness to this affective register would then allow for the possibility of both recognizing others with alternative sensibilities and engaging with them, here particularly about the Syrian revolutionaries. I arrive at these conclusions by putting to work a question that I encountered in my research on Islamic charitable endowments in Beirut, and it is a question that I would like to think with you about. It's a question about how arguments are won, and specifically about the place of reason and authority in argumentation. Authority, as Arendt reminds us, precludes both violence and persuasion. In the first place, authority precludes violence, since the use of force indicates that authority has failed to compel. And in the second place, authority precludes persuasion, because persuasion assumes equal relations in argumentation, whereas authority implies more hierarchical relations. Authority, therefore, as Arendt writes, operates at a different register than violence and persuasion. It operates through an inner binding. It functions through structures of feelings and dispositions that allow one to recognize the truth of certain claims and compels a person to obey them. Given that such pre-conscious registers are always at play, they bear on how we, as scholars inhabiting the world of argumentation and debate, bring particular dispositions to our analysis. Here, for example, to the analysis of the Arab uprisings. What makes these uprisings revolutionary or not depends not only on how we understand revolution, but on structures of feelings based on what appears to us as self-evident truths. Now, in my own research, I came to think about that question of authority when I was looking at a debate between Muslim religious scholars about charitable endowments, waqfs, dedicated to the family of the founder, whether these were an Islamic institution. At first blush, the scholars appeared to be divided between those who were traditionalists, who would deploy an appeal to reasoning derived from sacred texts based on classical legal methodology, and the modernists, who deploy and appeal economic reasoning. However, looking closer at their arguments over the question of are family waqfs an Islamic institution, I noticed that scholars on both sides of the debate drew their opponents into the orbit of their claims not by changing their opponents' thinking at its root. Rather, they won these arguments by using rhetorical devices that played on the very truths that their opponents took for granted. For example, in one instance, a traditionalist scholar challenged his opponent on the ground that his argument reflected an ignorance of Islamic legal methodology. This opponent, rather than claiming this challenge was irrelevant on the ground that economic sciences were the more valid method of making such a determination, responded by defending his own ability to speak authoritatively about Islamic law. In other words, despite taking a modernist position in this particular debate, when he responded to this challenge, he cast himself as a Muslim scholar who was trained in the tradition, who recognized the truth claim of the knowledge needed to derive law, and who recognized the methods of deriving it, thus reflecting his agreement as to the truth of Islamic tradition and legal methodology, and his agreement that actually misuse of legal method was a valid ground for critique. Likewise, in my research into this debate on how to characterize family waqf, I found a similar move operating in the opposite direction. So when challenged by modernists on the ground that their arguments reflected an ignorance of the terms of economic discourse, traditionalists responded not by dismissing that discourse as invalid, but rather by crafting rebuttals in that very idiom. In this manner, they expressed themselves as scholars interpolated by economic discourses who recognized truth claims related to those discourses. As those examples show, both economic sciences and the Islamic tradition were authoritative for members of both camps. That's probably more interesting to me as somebody who works on the Islamic tradition and the kind of reasons that work within the tradition. But for us in this context and for returning to Arendt, they mostly importantly demonstrate how authority itself figures at a certain remove from the realm of coercion or persuasion, and how, to quote Connolly, when we talk about authority, we're discussing visceral modes of appraisal. Because authority appeals to an embodied recognition of truth, to sensibilities, and to affects. And so it becomes important to examine the emotions at play in an undergirding argumentation because they reveal our deep-seated assumptions about what we recognize as true and allow for discussion that acknowledges the limits of rational debate, which I'm not definitely the first person to say that, and there's a whole literature on that, but I'm kind of putting it at play here. The significance and self-evident truth in analysis is sharply illustrated in the affective underpinnings of the discourses of analysts of the revolution in Syria. Particularly, I will examine the contradictions of the discourses of the anti-imperialist left with regards to American intervention in reaction to two distinct events, the Ghouta chemical attacks in 2013 and the ISIS siege of Kobani. As scholar Gilbert Ashar notes, while the discussion of American intervention in Syria in the aftermath of the Ghouta chemical attack led to a strong opposition from the anti-imperialist left, the U.S. strikes and dropping of weapons to break the ISIS siege of Kobani and its coordination with the Kurds was much less contested. In these arguments against U.S. intervention after Ghouta, U.S. intervention is portrayed as fueling escalation, going to jihadist groups, aiming at regime change that would benefit a wide range of American geopolitical interests, including isolating Hezbollah and Iran. The emotional charge running through this discourse is evident in the many moderated debates on the Syrian revolution that devolved into shouting matches. There's a bunch of them on the internet that just are kind of scary. I myself have seen friendships break and families feud over this topic. This knee-jerk anti-imperialism encapsulates the ingrained sensibilities which arise from a long and real history of American imperialism. From the Vietnam War to the invasion of Iraq to the toppling of leftist regimes in Central and Latin America, the truth of U.S. imperialism is certainly beyond a doubt. And Richard Falk, for example, talking about intervention in Kobani, he invokes this history with regards to the Middle East. The U.S.'s role in Syria, he says, much less Israel, Palestine, Egypt, and elsewhere in the region, figures into an overall strategy of dominating the region and supporting highly reactionary forces in the Gulf, particularly Saudi Arabia. Totally true. Given that history, he continues, Kobani presents a tragic predicament that does challenge the kind of anti-interventionism that I feel, he says, is justified overall, particularly in the Middle East. So anti-interventionism is not only a reasoned choice based on this conception of history, but also a visceral reaction of those who spent their life fighting imperialism. While this visceral anti-imperialism makes absolute sense, the arguments for anti-interventionism elide the massive disproportion of force between rebels and government forces, equate the Syrian opposition with Islamic terrorism, and above all, as Yassin Haj Saleh has argued, they render American geopolitical interests the determining lens through which to assess Syrians' actions. These arguments also highlight what anthropologist Fadi Berdawil identifies as the resurgence of, I quote, the fraught politics of internationalist solidarity between leftists in the metropole and revolutionaries in the peripheries, along the lines discussed by Aimé Césaire in his letter of resignation from the French Communist Party. Should the Syrians abandon their revolution because the US is supporting it for its own geopolitical agenda? Should the Kurds abandon their fight for an independent state because the US is supporting it? A good point of comparison for these questions in the context of the Syrian revolution, Yasser Mounif has argued in a conversation with Fanon scholar Nigel Gibson, is Fanon's take on the Algerian liberation movement and its choice in relationship to the Cold War. Gibson argues that for Fanon, the Cold War was, and I quote, a whirlwind sucking the independence movements into this kinds of either-or situation. For him, it was about liberation, Algerian liberation. That was the measure, end of quote. Even though the Syrian revolution was not undertaken under the banner of anti-colonial or anti-imperial liberation, if one sees the national elites and the Al-Assad regime as a continuation of that colonial order, Fanon's analysis of the FLN and its relation to the Cold War suggests that the main measure should be the liberation of the Syrian people and that the question of imperialism should be deferred. But let us come back to anti-imperialism and its affective pull. One wonders then about the reasons why there were very different mobilizations of the many on the left to intervention in the case of the Kurds of Kobani and that of the Syrian revolutionaries, when both of these interventions clearly are forms of American imperialism. The different reactions of many on the left seem to hinge on the kinds of projects these groups are perceived to have and the sympathies they elicit. The Kurds of Kobani, who have a distinct vision from those of Iraq, follow the leaders of the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party based in eastern Turkey, and the leader being Abdullah Öcalan, who has abandoned the project of a Kurdish state. Instead, inspired by the work of Murray Bookchin, he has adopted the vision of libertarian municipalism, calling for Kurds to create, and I quote, free governing, self-governing communities based on principles of direct democracy. In his vision, the liberation of women takes a central stage as well as environmental concerns. After the retreat of the Syrian regime from Rojava in July 2012, there was a chance to implement this vision, which included communes with gender equality, decisions at the local level concerning matters from garbage collection, heating distribution, to actually land ownership, cooperative enterprises, etc. Such a vision certainly resonates with leftist sensibilities, mine included, and it's no surprise that leftist news outlets ran extensive reportage on Rojava. Anthropologist and anarchist political activist David Graeber brings his family history's involvement with the Spanish revolutionaries during the 1936 Civil War to rally people to the cause of Kobani. But some of the similarities, I quote him, with the Spanish revolutionaries are so striking and so distressing that I feel it is incumbent on me, as someone who grew up in a family whose politics were in many ways defined by the Spanish Revolution, to say, we cannot let it end the same way. This is an ethical plea arising from and expressed in the affective language of a deeply felt identification with the Kurds of Rojava. An important reminder, not to be swayed by these sensibilities, is a week ago the unfurling of a huge portrait of Öcalan in Raqqa after its liberation. And the symbolic importance of this gesture with kind of nationalism, a man kind of dominating the scene, should not be lost on us. So on the other side of the spectrum, these are the Kurds of Rojava, the epithet used to critique supporters of the revolutionaries against Bashar al-Assad exemplifies the sensibilities at play in the case of the Syrian revolutionaries, and these would be Al-Qaeda supporters. So if you support the revolutionaries, you're a Al-Qaeda supporter. Such an appeal to the self-evident truth of the evil of Islamic radicalism, with its project of an Islamic state and the imposition of a patriarchal and oppressive Islamic law, calls for us to examine the foundations of this assumption. In these imaginaries, religion is still cast as the opposite of secularism, the reason that of authority, assumptions that have been obviously the subject of scrutiny in anthropology, religious studies, etc. Nonetheless, they still remain the baseline of general conceptions of the secular state in such debates, and obscure a deeper look at the practices of these revolutionaries. Before moving to these practices, I would like to turn to the other factor informing assessments of the revolution, namely our understandings of the revolution. Here I draw on some of the readings you have done in this class and that I enjoyed reading. The modern concept of a revolution, as Costa shows, supposed, I quote, the repeated contamination of revolution and evolution, and the idea that the objective of a political revolution should be the social emancipation of all men, transforming the social structure. In the case of the Arab uprisings, Fayette, who has always provided with us with a nuanced understanding of Islamist politics, argues that the Arab uprisings were revolutionary in their mobilization, but not in outcome. They, I quote him, brought little structural change, were poor in vision and strategy of transformation. They were concerned more with democracy, human rights, and the rule of law than allocation of property and distributive justice, end of quote. As democracy, human rights, and rule of law belong to the realm of politics, Fayette proposes that these uprisings were not revolutionary because they did not call for social structural change. They were purely political revolutions. But could we nonetheless see these uprisings as revolutionary in what Simona Forti in her blog post has described to be a minoritarian tradition based on Arendt? The Syrian revolution provided an experience of freedom that could be the foundation of a new tradition. Activists got together in coordination committees, tansiqiyat, which divided labor based on skills from media to mobilization to humanitarian work and politics. Furthermore, Bashar al-Assad's collective punishment of rebel towns through siege, cutting off electricity and water, in addition to airstrikes, have forced people in these towns to organize and find creative solutions to continue living, from digging wells to producing fuels from plastic to mechanical contraptions to generate electricity, etc., etc. Under these conditions, with no competition from the state to order life, Islamic tradition could form an important resource for ordering living together. The collective Friday prayers, for example, were a spontaneous mobilization in both Egypt and Syria. They were an important moment. Such initiatives create conditions for new ways of doing things and for embodying new traditions, especially when they have to be maintained not for months, but even years. And this is not, as I say, just a few weeks in a square. This is about sustaining daily life and learning how to live with others and inhabit the world differently. It's about developing particular sensibilities and affect, despite the savagery of the regime. Being attentive to sensibilities and affects remind us then that the success of arguments does not rest only on reason. It might help us move beyond the strong inclination to try and provide better arguments or space of debate as a way to convince people, like Trump supporters. Given that such pre-conscious registers are always at play, I cannot but agree with Connolly that instead of, and I quote, the Habermasian ideal of a consensus between rational agents who rise above their interests and sensibilities, you might substitute that of ethically sensitive negotiated settlements while jointly coming to appreciate the unlikelihood of reaching rational agreement, along with an ethic of cultivation and an ethos of engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard, and thank you very much, Soha and Nada. So I'll speak a little bit about sort of some of what we've heard, and I'll talk about the Tunisian experience in particular, and then turn it over back to you, Bernard. So in some of the questions that you posited, Bernard, for us to be thinking about, and thinking about Arab uprisings or Arab Spring in general, one of the issues that I've had in thinking about this whole notion is the fact that these uprisings happened according to conditions, some of which may be common and may be shared and that may have intersected, but also in very different environments. And to think about the Arab Spring, which many analysts have done, as sort of happening in one region that is, to reduce it to sort of, a singular region that sounds monolithic, is somewhat misguided. I mean, I think the conditions that predated each of those uprisings are different, and the situation historically, including not only in the decades leading to the uprisings, but over a longer period of time, that define a place like Tunisia are very different than even neighboring Libya's, and certainly Syria, and then if you extend further to Yemen. So that's one point I wanted to make at the very beginning. The next point is to think about sort of, why does the Tunisian experience stand out? It stands out because relatively it has been the only successful outcome of these uprisings, whatever we want to call them, that happened sort of concurrently or in very close succession in that same general region. It is not over yet in Tunisia, so I think it's very important to underscore that. It's a very fragile democracy. But, if we look at where Bernard has started us off with the self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi, and as Soha pointed out, with 300 deaths relative to the tens of thousands of deaths that took place in other places, and that is even before Syria developed into a civil war. It was a peaceful revolt for the most part, resulted in the ouster of Ben Ali. In 2011, we saw continuing protests, making some demands of the transitional government. Those demands were met. For example, that none of the actors in the Ben Ali regime and who were members of his ruling party would have any position in the transitional government. We saw demands for for elections for a constituent assembly met, and on October 23rd, 2011, not only did we have fair elections that were held, but we also had three parties, disparate parties, one of them Islamist, come together and form a coalition, the Troika, that would share in the power structure in Tunisia, which it did. And then 2013, on the heels of two political assassinations, when things looked like they were going to crumble, we had what I would consider non-traditional actors. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Civil society organizations come together and basically salvage the situation, negotiate with Al-Nahda, the political, the Islamist party, to withdraw from government, a technocratic government to be negotiated as the next transitional government that would oversee the adoption of a constitution in 2014, and also later in 2014, parliamentary elections and the election of the first democratically elected president for the country. So that's what makes sort of Tunisia, at least on the surface, stand out. You know, it's the only successful story that has emerged from the uprisings, in contrast to Syria, Libya, Yemen, and certainly also to Egypt, where there was a lot of parallelism going on. Today in Tunisia, we have concerns about perceptions of a concentration of power in the hands of the presidency, a reconciliation law that provides amnesty to former public officials who were part of the Ben Ali regime, who were accused of corruption. We see talk about constitutional amendments, you know, a lot of things that make people like myself a little bit worried, but overall still optimistic that this process is going to continue to be positive. So the big question is why? I mean, so looking at sort of, you know, what has happened over the past few years is certainly very encouraging, and I think fairly depicts Tunisia as an exception to the experiences that have been the case, you know, for other countries in the region. The question of why is, I think, a very, very interesting one, and that brings us back to the point I started then with, which is the fact that you had a very different history, a very different set of factors and environments that defined those countries and the people who revolted against their regimes. And in the case of Tunisia, what I propose is that there were some structural factors and that helped Tunisia. There were some luck factors, if you will, some environmental factors. For example, the fact that Tunisia is a homogeneous country, 98% Sunni Muslim, so absent has been sectarian tensions within the country. It's been a small, unimportant country, detached from the center of gravity of inter-Arab intrigue and of the Arab-Israeli conflict, notwithstanding the fact that the PLO was headquartered in Tunis after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. And it was not really important, either to the Arab world or to the superpowers of the world. It did not get entangled in the Cold War. It did not have the oil resources that would have made it perhaps play a bigger role. Interestingly, you know, for the Arab world, it was not important. It was sort of detached, you know, a small country on the Mediterranean, not really relevant, if you will. Today, it's far more relevant because a successful democratic transition in Tunisia is threatening to many of the authoritarian regimes, especially of the Gulf nations. So today, you find countries like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar vying for influence, for economic influence in Tunisia. So, and then, you know, of course, the fact that Tunisia has had boundaries and borders that have remained more or less intact for centuries. And I would argue that Tunisia also, because of its proximity to Europe and because of trade, economic, as well as ideas, exchanges, and influences that came from Europe in the 19th century more recently, but also in past phases of its history, you know, all of those factors have really resulted in a Tunisia that even as far back as the 19th century was, in a way, a nation waiting to become a state. You know, there is a Tunisian identity that has been formed over centuries, and that lacks some of the tensions that may exist in other parts of that region, an identity that is made up of multiple civilizational influences that happened over the centuries. So those are the structural factors. But what I argue are that there are factors of dimensions of agency that played a very, very big role in the Tunisian experience and that were missing in the rest of the Arab world. And those have to do with reform and reformism. And it was interesting, Bernard, in your write-up, you talked about my turning Asif Fayette on its head and his idea of revolution. In the case of Tunisia, a long history of reform, I argue, has really facilitated this successful so far transition to democracy. That history of reformism has really made its biggest impact in 4 areas. One has been the advancement of the rights of women, to which Habib Bourguiba, the first president of the country, is given a lot of credit for, deservedly, but I don't think he deserves that exclusively. So in 1956, the adoption of the Code Statut Personnel, the same year that the country became independent of the French, emancipated women and gave them more rights than they enjoy today in any other Arab country. For example, polygamy has been outlawed in Tunisia since 1956, whereas it is still legal in Muslim societies throughout the Arab world. The right to vote came in 1957. Access to birth control in 1961. Abortion became legal in 1973, the same year as Roe versus Wade. But that reform really did not originate with Bourguiba. There was an environment that allowed for the adoption of these reforms. Intellectuals from within Al Zaytuna Mosque argued from within Islam for the emancipation of women as early as the late 19th century, and perhaps, most importantly, in 1930 through the publication of an important treatise by Tahir Haddad, who was an Islamic scholar at Zaytuna, Imra'atuna fil Sharia wal Mujtama, Our Women in Sharia and Society, through which he argued for exactly the same kinds of things that Bourguiba 26 years later codified into law through the Code Statut Personnel. The second area of reform that was really very critical was in the area of education, where again, secular education had started making a mark in Tunisia as far back as 1840 with the establishment of the Bardo Academy, followed by the establishment of Sadiq College in 1875 at the hands of Khairuddin al-Tunisi, who at the time had given up on trying to reform the teachings within Zaytuna Mosque and established a parallel track through the secular Sadiqi College. Later in that century and early into the 20th century, reforms started taking place within Zaytuna, but at the same time, other secular education projects saw the light of day. And what was interesting also is the relationship between the colonized in the case of the Tunisians and the French colonizers. It was a very, very different relationship than, for example, the one between the French in Algeria and between the Egyptians and the British colonizers. And that relationship allowed for reforms to take place under the French and to avoid the rejection of everything colonial. So what Bourguiba and his compatriots and those who preceded them worked very hard to do was to really take advantage of the French presence and the French intellectual presence in Tunisia and became products themselves of the French education systems. Once independence was granted in 1956, one of the other early attempts by Bourguiba to modernize the country was to adopt an education system that continues to stand out against other Arab education systems. A bilingual education system, a secular education system that then and now limits the amount of religious teaching to 2 hours a week compared to places like Saudi Arabia, where a student has to take 9 hours of Islamic education every week, plus 8 hours of Arabic taught through the Quran, and 5 hours of math and 3 hours of science. the only country where the education system from the beginning included 2 years of education and instruction in philosophy, something that is absent in education systems elsewhere in the region. So education was another area of reform that, again, that reform started in the 19th century. The third area was the moderation of the role of religion in society. So unlike the case of Turkey, where we had Ataturk abolish religion from the public space, in the case of Tunisia, there had already been an experience with Islam that allowed for moderation, and what our late colleague Al Stepan coined a twin toleration, toleration by the state of religion and by religion of the state. And that tradition continued under Bourguiba, was reinforced under Bourguiba, suffered somewhat under Ben Ali and his forced secularization. But in a nutshell, I think, the reform of Islam within Zaytuna, the kind of experience that Tunisia and Tunisians had with Islam, and the moderation of the role of Islam in society and education systems, which allowed for the advancement of the rights of women, was a very important factor. A fourth factor that was, I mentioned before, is the role of civil society. Tunisia stands out today as perhaps, with the slight exception of Lebanon and to some extent Egypt, where civil society is non-existent today under the Sisi regime, there has been a very long history of civil society activism in Tunisia, rooted in a labor union movement that continued to flourish under the authoritarianism of Bourguiba and Ben Ali. Whereas, for example, if you look at the Egyptian case, the labor union movement, which was started also at around the same time as it was in Tunisia in the 1920s, came under the control of the state under Jamal Abdel Nasser, was totally crushed, and in 1957 was reorganized to become an instrument of the state. And in the lead up to the revolution and during the revolution, in Egypt, civil society, the labor union movement specifically, did not side with the revolutionaries. If anything, it did not play a positive role at the very least. And what Tunisia had in terms of a very strong labor union movement, Egypt, of course, had in the form of the military. So that's another huge structural difference. In Tunisia, the army size is around 40,000. So you had a very small army, a very active and strong labor union movement. The reverse has been true in the case of Egypt. So I'll stop here probably, to say that the exercise of authority also in Tunisia, I would propose, has been through and I'll be very interested in hearing your views on this, Nada, the ability to reach consensus, the ability to compromise and to debate, which really helped Tunisia sort of survive the turbulence of 2013, when many observers expected that the experiment was coming to an end and that Tunisia was likely to follow a very similar path to Egypt's, which it has not. So there you have it. Thank you. Thank you.
Terrific. So we actually have a very interesting constellation here of positions, I think, that I'd like to arrange them in the following way, I think. Soha Bayoumi started us off by spotlighting the kind of grassroots origin of protest and mobilization, right? Showing us precisely how ordinary, even non-political, non-politicized actors can get drawn into mass protest, and suggesting that so much of the movements that did take place may have been triggered in these ways by political actors who weren't revolutionaries themselves, but got kind of brought into the movements. Now, Nada Moumtaz, in her analysis of the kind of clear inconsistencies of the left imperialists on the different interventions and the way in which, you know, I mean, we're familiar with these inconsistencies, right? I mean, we see them all the time, not only among left anti-imperialists, but, you know, where do we bomb, where do we don't bomb, right? I mean, so there's these inconsistencies, you know, when does Clinton bomb, when does he not bomb, et cetera, all of that, and where do we intervene and where do we not intervene? I think we see that clearly. We see it clearly in actors across the political spectrum. But I think perhaps, and I'm not sure, maybe unintentionally, I'm not sure, but somehow this does highlight, to me at least in hearing it, the important role of the U.S. and Europe in shaping how these original mobilizations play out, right? Through the internationalization of the upheaval and the aftermath, and the internationalization and the exploitation of the turmoil that results as these mass movements start to have effects, right? And it then becomes important, right? As to, I mean, what's going to happen is going to depend in large part as to whether or not we do intervene in Rojava or not, right? And whether, right? So there's a sense in which we're moving between these dimensions, and in a sense, Safwan Masri's intervention situates itself between the two and negotiates some relationship between them, I think, at least. That's the way I hear it. Because, and the case of Tunisia being the perfect illustration of this. How? Because it's the longer history of civil society, which itself is tied in complicated ways to a history of colonialism and imperialism, right? And a longer history of the ways that citizens and mobilized citizens and others in a country relate to foreign intervention and have crafted their own polis, in a way, in relationship to this history of civil society, this history of foreign intervention, colonialism, the end of colonialism, etc. That those long histories then serve in some way to negotiate the space between the grassroots mobilizations, the international interventions, and having an effect then on the outcomes and on the various different outcomes, right? To show somehow that the original political movements at times may well have been very localized, as Soha was kind of pointing to us, but co-opted both internally, possibly by the military, externally by foreign countries like the US and Europe, resulting, though, in these different outcomes, possibly depending on the longer histories that each of these peoples and countries have had with that very history, right, of the relationship between mobilization and foreign intervention, right? So it's kind of, it's an internal dynamic over time that then has these different outcomes. Now, I did hear, I think, in Safwan's intervention, this idea that maybe the Tunisian revolution is, in fact, something that could come close to a social revolution, as we were talking about the modern concept of revolution with Costa, right? I mean, as something that has brought about now a change in the social fabric and social relations. Now, whether it was intended as such, well, it's not clear that modern revolutions necessarily intended as such, but in any event, it might be that particular kind of model. In the other situations that are less uplifting, to put it mildly, in the other countries that are, some of which have been just completely devastated by this, the question then becomes, how can we think about uprising somehow autonomously, maybe? Can you think about the mobilization as a separate moment from what then comes into play, the internationalization, the foreign interventions, the internationalization of the civil war in Syria, or not? Can we actually think of those as a moment, as something that we need to reflect on, which of course I think would be very relevant to all of us in this room in terms of our own forms of protest, right? Because you know, you can do the same thing with, you know, the Occupy movement and ask what that form of mobilization and how that form of mobilization was then related to other interventions that resulted in the, you know, second election of President Obama first, and then some kind of a reverse course with the Trump administration, right? And whether you can actually separate the protest and the decision to protest at that moment to its kind of dire consequences, right, today. So anyway, so I think that the interventions actually work perfectly to kind of frame a little bit the extremes of what's possible to think about in terms of the Arab Spring. And so maybe what we could do now is open it up to a few questions. Maybe we'll take around maybe 4 questions and then ask our speakers to kind of respond, address the conversation. And maybe we'll start with one of our brilliant graduate students, Lejane.
I have so many thoughts that I'm not sure I can put in form of questions, but I'll try. Soha, you spoke about the ordinary non-traditional political actors who got implicated in the revolution by accident, but just by physical existence in the Tahrir Square. And I was wondering, how do you relate that to can we infer from this that the less politicized, because also Asif Bayat refers to this inability to break with the old order as a factor that led to the co-optation of the revolution, the counter-revolution. And so how is that, is it, to me, it seems whether to kind of mobilize on the traditional institutions that you have, the traditional political actors, or is it more successful if you actually politicize something that hasn't always been political per se? Would that be would you characterize it as such, this politicization of this at this moment of those of those institutions or organizations, the syndicate, the unions that didn't have such contaminated political history, is what actually facilitated their role towards a successful kind of mobilization, or a more hopeful?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this fantastic panel in which, well, we see at the same time, indeed, this one, in a certain way, the renewal of political discourse. I think that one of the elements that you are underlining is that kind of renewal of political discourse through, perhaps, as Lejane has mentioned, understanding in the end that the less, or originally less politicized actors may have had a specific way for success, and that in this specific way for success, also they have mobilized at the same time, on the one hand, a traditional institutions like Waqfa or ways of understanding authority, etc., and on the other hand, of course, historical, structural, and reformist ideas and processes and so on. I just wanted to ask something that we haven't mentioned. Maybe it is already very trivial, and maybe it doesn't need to be underscored again, but I find strictly intriguing. It was in which social mobilization, grassroots mobilization, forms of getting engaged in this renewal of politics or political renovation are linked as well to internationalization. They are not separate from internationalization because of the use of what we call social media. and what we and what we see in this sense of also a renewal of processes of communication. So I would like you to address this question of social media in that renewal of political discourse.
Thank you. Okay, I've got, I had two other hands I saw here, and then we'll get them, and then we'll do a round, another round, okay? Aurélie, and then Michael.
Thank you. Oh, okay. That's okay. So my question is related actually to what Jesus just said. Bernard, you talked at the beginning, you asked in your introductory remarks if the Arab Spring were a new modality of revolution. And it made me think about how the 15M in Spain and the Occupy movement here are thought as imitation of the Arab Springs, and how there was a creation of an international network between this uprising through the web. In fact, there were exchanges from Cairo to Madrid, Cairo to New York, and elsewhere. And in these exchanges, activists talked about how protesting was not enough, how they had to occupy public space that has been a public space that had been privatized and modified, and which reminded me of Lefebvre's right to the city. And I think it's something that is quite important in these uprisings. And actually representatives of Occupy Wall Street traveled to Cairo. I mean, there was a lot of exchanges. So I'd like to ask you about the role of the internet, of the platform, the media platform in this process. That is not only about how the internet, the virtual platform played a central role in the physical occupation itself, how the disembodied platform could give birth to an exponential mobilization of bodies in the places, in the plazas, right? But also how this same platform afterwards encouraged an international dialogue, international networks for the creation of political concepts and for new forms of practicing politics.
Here.
Thank you. I don't want to cause too much of a distraction by going back 30 years to the first Intifada, but I've been trying to fit it into the framework of this of today's discussion. And at the time of the Arab Spring, there was quite a lot written about how the first Intifada was a precursor to the events of the Arab Spring. I don't know to what extent that was actually on people's minds. I've heard comments in both directions. But a few things I want to stress. First, with regard to the question of foundation or authority, in some sense, the first Intifada and the history of the Palestinian national movement provides a textbook case of the establishment of authority and the foundation. The foundation, as it's described now, would be the Nakba, but this actually became, in my understanding, the basis for authority with the creation of the PLO, which was for many years and even now specifically identified as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, as if there was a need to make that clear. That's one point. Now, at the time of the first Intifada, this was actually challenged. This was challenged on the ground by civil society, which had been holding together the occupied territories, and it's quite striking that the kinds of people who not otherwise politicized people in the countries of the Arab Spring were constantly politicized. I can't think of any other country in the world, any other place in the world where the population is so politicized. And the leadership of the first Intifada, which was not militarized, unlike the second Intifada, was consisted largely of people like the people in this room. So I would, I mean, a lot of, now since it did not lead, it was not successful in the sense that it did not lead to realizing its goals, it might be said that it was not a revolution. Nevertheless, it did establish a framework within which the Palestinian national struggle remains. That's what I
We've got, apologies, four questions, and maybe we'll come back this way. So I'll start with Safwan, and we'll come back this way, okay? But kind of short answers so that we can get another round. But we've got four issues, I think, on the table. The first one, working backwards again, Michael's question about kind of the role of the PLO, the role of the first Intifada, and kind of how that influenced and had a place in the Arab Spring. Aurélie, I think, is raising this question of the exchanges and ways in which these movements traveled through social media and the role of the internet. Jesus is also focusing on social media and its role in the internationalization of these movements. And then Logéne takes us back to the questions of the politicization and depoliticization, I take it, of some of the organizations that were on the ground. So, Safwan.
Sure, and I may not answer them in 4 answers to 4 questions, but I'll share some reactions to the questions. And again, I'll start with the notion of a new modality of revolution. I think is a very difficult one to answer because, again, these were different revolutions. I think what Tunisia did is it inspired and gave courage, I think, to Arab publics who had been, don't forget, that the, Ottoman Empire, followed by imperialism, colonialism, followed by a different form of imperialism. So you had, authoritarian regimes put in place by the former colonial powers. So for publics in the Arab world, to rise up required sort of a series of events to take place, and for the, I think what Tunisia did, and then it gave, first, I think, and Soha, you can correct me if you feel differently, Tahrir Square started at the beginning as sort of encouragement of what was going on in Tunisia, sort of a feeling of pride in what was happening in Tunisia. And then, but very quickly, it developed a life of its own and became about the rights of Egyptians in their own right. And I think, that kind of inspiration also took hold in other places, but how it manifested itself was very different. I think, the way that the Syrians revolted and how it started in Daraa and how it had been really triggered by years of drought and economic factors, how it demonstrated itself in Yemen, in Libya, are quite different, that I don't think that one is able to come up with any definition of a sort of a common modality, if you will, of revolution. So I'll say that. The Intifada question is an incredibly interesting one. I think it is sort of, it did challenge the status quo. It challenged the authority exercised by the PLO. And it was an Intifada and to some extent a revolutionary outcry or uprising for political rights, right? For political rights, for the rights to self-determination, for the end of oppression. And it did not succeed because that oppression continues, but nonetheless, it, I think, redrafted sort of the contract, if you will, or the prism through which we look at things. I think with the Arab Spring revolutions, economic factors played a huge role. Economic factors, the kleptocracy in the case of Ben Ali, the corruption in the case of Egypt, the economic disenfranchisement in the cases of Libya and of Syria played a huge role in all of those. So I think those are some of the common threads. The question of the social mobilization and social media, I think that played a huge role in all of it. In the case of Tunisia specifically, from a small town of Sidi Bouzid in rural Tunisia, how the self-immolation of Bouazizi became a rallying cry that every Tunisian identified with, and the mobilization of the middle class, which was really crucial to all of this. The issue of dignity became something that every Tunisian identified with. The union, the labor union, played a very big role also in organizing protests, facilitating the logistics for the protests. And I think what's also very important to remember in the Tunisian case, the revolution had started at least a couple of years before then. We had big riots in Gafsa in 2008, then repression by the Ben Ali regime, but that became sort of the revolution that started, but that was stampeded on very, very quickly, and at least the labor union movement, but you throughout were waiting for the next opportunity for something to flare up. And between 2008 and 2010, social media played a huge role. I mean, first it was WikiLeaks, and then it was Tunis Leaks when WikiLeaks was shut down, that crystallized for Tunisians the extent of the kleptocracy of the Ben Ali regime. So when Bouazizi self-immolated, social media and the labor union both played a huge role in getting everybody on the same page, trying to ensure that that opportunity was not missed.
Thank you. Nada?
Thank you. With regards to continue on the social media stuff, and I think definitely that was a very important factor in being able to reach people without being kind of repressed, and with text messages, with Facebook, etc. And that was, if you recall, even before the Tahrir, etc., there was all of these videos of police violence that were being circulated, and these were very important in kind of mobilizing people around that cause. But I also like to do a bit of a pushback against that, because I do believe that circulations of ideas have been something that's been going on for a long time, and this is not very new from, I usually like to give the 19th century examples, but even in the 19th century and the early 20th century, ideas of radical ideas from the Bolsheviks were kind of circulating in the Middle East, and that's something that was a very important aspect of it. So I don't want to just say that this is very new. It enables kind of a different speed, perhaps, etc., but it's not just that. And with regards to the first Intifada, and I think it's definitely true, and it's very similar in the sense of the challenge of the PLO. But again, it was crushed, and very consciously crushed as such. And I think perhaps it did open the space of, for questioning that authority. But again, the thing that the history of the First Intifada is not something that's very written, and there's an attempt to try and recuperate that within, Palestinian, history, because it could be such an important foundational moment. Because all you think about are people throwing stones. I mean, just like that's the image, but that was not just that. It was much more than that, and that's what you're actually pointing at. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Can I start by telling the story of Tahrir Square and how it started? So Tahrir, so there was a call, again, on Facebook and on social media for January 25th, 2011, for people to take to the street to protest. January 25th is is called Police Day, Eid al-Shurta in Egypt. It's supposedly to celebrate heroic acts by the police in the resistance against the British. However, it became a day that symbolized the brutality of the police state, right? And so the calls started actually before the Tunisian Revolution to protest on January 25th, which was a holiday, basically. When the Tunisian Revolution happened, and when Ben Ali basically was ousted on January 14th, people, Egyptians, took to the street to celebrate. And then it came this inspiration. Oh, like this could happen. It's possible. It's doable. You could oust someone who has been in office for 30 years, and people were like inspired by that. And against all odds, January 25th became this. You call your revolution the revolution of January 14th. This is when Ben Ali was ousted. We call a revolution January 25th. This is when it started. And everyone was... I'm not Tunisian, by the way. Oh, you're not? Okay. Sorry. The idea that people were joking about, you don't set an appointment for a revolution. You don't say like, oh, we're going to have a revolution on January 25th, right? But that's kind of what happened. And when people took to the streets on January 25th, they were not sure that it was going to be a revolution, even though some on Facebook started calling it a revolution, right? And it's only 3 days later, on January 28th, and when people started occupying Tahrir Square, and when the police fled and the military intervened, that it started to look like a revolution, right? But it's really on January 25th at night that, for the first time, the chant of "the people want the downfall of the regime" was heard on the streets of Cairo. Okay, I want to go to the point about ordinary actors and politicization, depoliticization, etc. And also this idea of like whether the actors that I'm describing, all of them were non-revolutionaries who just happened to be on the scene and were swept up in the action. I think this may describe some of the people who were there and who got swept up in the action, but not everyone. There were people who were involved in political action before that. Of course, the political sphere under Mubarak was very strictly monitored and also almost foreclosed as well, even though there were political parties and a semblance of civil society, etc. But there was no real room for action. Asaf Bayat also talks about this idea of the city inside out, how those megalopolis, this idea of the huge urban subaltern that he talks about people on the street, right, in those huge urban centers, in a city like Cairo with over 20 million people, where you have not only like street vendors and merchants and mechanics and messengers, but also like sex workers, etc., who are on the street all the time and who become the fuel of that, urban subaltern, and they're ready, if you will, for any spark to go into action somehow because of what they witness and what they are part of, right? What I'm trying to argue specifically when it comes to this question of what is political and what is not political is that professional demands in authoritarian settings cannot be just dismissed as apolitical, right? In the effacement, the intentional effacement of the political that they do, there is a reinscription of the political, right? The fact that when you see 10,000 physicians on the street saying that, oh, we're not being political, we're being professional here, right? But they're chanting down with the police state. I think that that's interesting, a phenomenon that's worth analyzing, right? It's this idea of the traditional categories of what counts as political or not, or apolitical, need to be revisited, right? When we're looking at non-traditional actors, the medical syndicate. I'm sorry, I don't want to take too much time, but the medical syndicate was actually a very political body before Mubarak. For 30 years, it was monopolized by the National Democratic Party, the head of the medical syndicate was a member, leading member of the National Democratic Party of Mubarak, and the rest of the executive board of the medical syndicate were mostly Muslim Brotherhood members, right? And so it was highly politicized under Mubarak for 30 years. No elections happened for 19 years, until 2011 when the first election happened. And so but when the doctors, the independent doctors who took over the medical syndicate, won in 2011, they never described themselves as political. They described themselves as a professional group and claimed that their demands and their agenda was professional, primarily professional. I don't think I have time to talk about social media, but maybe that will.
Well, maybe I'll just say a word about that before I pass the mic to Etienne, and I've got a few others. I've got a lot of others. Okay, so I'll be very brief too. But I think that there is this opportunity here with the Arab Spring, right? To rethink modalities of revolt as a result of the internet and social media in a new way. Now, obviously, there are large debates, Evgeny Morozov and others, about it doesn't lead to more democracy, it does lead, it has these effects, it doesn't have these effects. There's also large debates about the fact that, yes, of course, there was transmission of ideas before, and so, nothing is new. But I think that it's right that, we can locate here something about the changed world that we are in right now, and we're going to be going. Next session is on #Black Lives Matter, right? So there is something here that I think we can kind of try to identify in terms of the way in which movements are possibly beginning to change as a result of the digital age, and I think so that's worth. And
that plays a very big role. Sorry,
I also want to, part of the important comment that you bring also, I think, already is the question of, it's a south to north kind of influence. And I think that's really what's really important. And that's what I wanted to highlight. Yeah, usually it's the opposite, usually that's highlighted. And I forgot to say the 19th century, I was thinking of the constitutional revolutions. So that's kind of, I didn't mention what I was thinking about, but that's what I was thinking about.
Okay.
Sorry.
I think the role of social media was not only in terms of the spreading of ideas, but I think what was very, very powerful also was the imagery that was transmitted over social media, which could not have as easy.
So it affects not only the movement, but the internationalization of it also. Okay, we've got lots of hands, so I'm going to take 6. We got Etienne, Nadia,
Thank you. Okay, it's a complicated question. I'll try to simplify it. It has to do with the internationalization, of course. It has to do with social media, add to the social media, the non-social media, Al Jazeera, and so on. It has to do with what Michael raised, etc. It's a question about what the adjective Arab means in Arab Spring. So I believe to understand that Tariq would have addressed that more or less, but it seems to me that the question perhaps is worth discussing even without him. And if I may just add 2 sentences. One, I believe many of us are aware of the fact that the phrase Arab Spring is not a very satisfactory etiquette, and it's criticized from all sides for a number of reasons. Spring, Arab, and so on. But the fact is that we needed somehow to enter into the complex debate. So in the end, my question is something like, do you think, and in which sense, that the so-called Arab Springs, what happened, the way it happened, the participations, the new modalities of doing politics, the circulation of models, and also, of course, the tragic continuation of all that, changed something in the common narrative about the Arabness of politics or revolution in the Middle East. Yeah. And if I know, okay, I have to stop, but I don't want to second guess any of the interventions, why they are mentioning certain events, insisting, for example, in the case of Nada, on the importance of Kobani and the changes in Öcalan's position, but not mentioning Gezi Park, if I'm not wrong. So that apparently Gezi Park and Taksim Square is not part of the discussion about the Arab Spring, or the fact that you, so is that completely ridiculous point, or do we need to somehow modify our perception of the geography and the genealogy of politics in that part of the world as a consequence of what happened, and is, of course, not finished?
Thank you, Etienne. Thank you. All right.
Hi, I'm Palvisha. I'm an LLM student here. In a conversation with one of my peers, she mentioned that the Arab youth has now espoused the term Arab Spring in a sort of a tongue-in-cheek way. And my question basically is, considering that there's very specific ways in which one revolution or uprising relates to the other, and there are very particular ways in which, I mean, the West has also has selective recognition of the revolutionary character of each of these uprisings. Do you think, A, that the term is justifiably homogenizing? And how do you think that relates to the internationalization of the uprisings? And how do you think the phrase itself sort of, as a metaphor, sort of even possibly indicates to the potential longevity of the consequences or the results of this revolution, or this set of revolutions and uprisings?
Yeah, I'd like to continue this track on longevity and the longue durée of revolutions, because I was always thinking, comparing so-called Arab Spring, without looking for the meaning of it, with the 1848 in Europe, because it was a kind of internationalization of the same or similar kind of desires and projects and wills, and then decline into strong dictatorial counter-revolution. But the movement was never stopped, because it's very hard to say what is a failure, what is success, in relation to what and to kind of historical length we are talking about. So this is a long history that it will have in the future. What is it is interesting now to understand is what kind of mobilization after. That is, what are the underground movements after? What kind of connections do they have country to country? Who are the actors more involved in this moment of reconsidering what went wrong, trying to understand what can be done? This kind of classical topos in the revolutions all the time when they went wrong and so on and so forth. So I would like to understand then after this so-called failure, which is perhaps not in absolute failure, of course.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to ask the panel the question of, when did the armed forces and security instruments of the state join the revolution? Because when Bernard raised the question that Tariq had said to us to read April Thesis of Lenin, which is issued in the day after he arrives into Petrograd, well, he would not have been able to write and issue that into the environment he did unless the Russian army had disintegrated and revolted and had 6 million casualties in the First World War. It mutinied, disintegrated. And if you look at the situation of the Arab Spring, three of the examples, the armies did not, they split, they splintered, and they fought. Egypt is a different example. You know, Egyptian military had a dominance in the GDP of Egypt and did not revolt. The Tunisian chief of staff on the 24th declares that the army is in favor of the revolution. So and you get into Occupy. I watched Occupy first, as I know a number of people here in New York did, and one of the things they could never address was, how do you win over the forces of repression? So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about what happened, because we know what happened. How can we learn from that to have something more beneficial happen in the future?
I'll just follow up a little bit on both Nadia and Etienne's questions. There is a prior example of social media based democracy movement. It's the movement from Thailand, 1991-92, 20 years previously, which brought down a military government, and of course was very quickly substituted for by an equally repressive regime. Of course, it was done in the name of the monarchy, but it somehow disappears from all our histories of kind of social media-based revolutionary movements. But if there is something to be learned about what happens in that movement from the cell phone-based uprising to the more fully digitized image-based social media, I think it might have to do with the transformation of the temporal consciousness that within which these events are read. I mean, there are not like 30, 40-year-long anti-colonial nationalist movements that involve the organization of military and very complex international funding sources and so forth. I mean, the strange thing is that one can imagine that the coming together of 200,000 or 300,000 people in a manner that can be seen, that gives itself to be seen, would in and of itself be sufficient to catalyze a kind of broad, transformative kind of process. But I mean, I heard you, Safwan, saying that, in fact, one should read the events of Tunisia not as revolutionary, but precisely as the demand for the actualization of those principles that had already been enunciated in a relatively universalist, democratic kind of form for over a period of 70, 80 years. Not necessarily counter-revolutionary, but simply a demand for the realization of what was already in place. Whereas the claims being made in the other nations that we've been talking about were for displacement of the occupants of power, not necessarily the transformation of the structures within which it would be exercised. I mean, it's a decapitation model, regime change model, but it's the temporal compression which makes impossible the kind of either the organizational labor or the judgment in the long duration, what actually could have been achieved under those temporal circumstances.
Yes, thank you. I have the feeling, listening to your very interesting talks, that we have this main idea in the background that every single revolution is made in order to achieve some kind of social emancipation or political freedom, or even, let's say, maybe human rights or something like that. But it's not even an idea or something, just a thought or a feeling. But is it possible that some of those revolutions were made to achieve something else than those social emancipation? Because we are talking about imperialism, but I'm afraid maybe when we think that every single revolution is targeting social emancipation, we are not using a word, but we are using our mind and our thinking to keep doing this imperialism on those people, because there's maybe other reason. Maybe they wanted someone more spiritual at the head of the state. Maybe when I see the Brotherhood winning election after in Egypt, or when I look at Syria, Syria is a fake state created by a foreign nation with very different identities. Maybe people are just doing revolution to promote their identity and to have something else, something different. I know if I was living in a country where my boundary would be drawn by a foreign nation in the middle of the desert on a straight line, and that would mean nothing to me, I would be pretty angry and I would probably riot for that. So do you think there could be other reasons that there can be revolutions and social emancipation and political freedom?
Responses. I'm actually not going to intervene and summarize the 6 questions. So you can choose the ones that you want to kind of further here. And who wants to start? I see, Nada, you kind of look like you really want to start.
Exactly. See, there's a good thing to start. I can take a question I can easily address. I would say just to the question of these, yes, sorry, to the fact that these nations were drawn on maps. I mean, not only that, there was a lot of, agency of people who actually wanted to create these states. So I think there's a very nice article, if you're interested, on the kind of Sykes-Picot and the fact that these nations are not real. And in fact, now Syria exists, and there's Syrian nationalism, and we have to deal with it. So I don't think that's just that. It doesn't mean that within Syrian nationalism there was no oppression of Kurds, and that the Kurds are not asking for different things. But I think that's a good moment to kind of rethink these, how we can have a more inclusive kind of polity, or with regards to the question of the Arab Spring, and if we should call it the Arab Spring, I mean, just to answer Etienne, I was particularly thinking about Syria. I'm not trying to make a claim particularly about, in general, what's happening. That's why I didn't address that. And I do not, just let me say, I do not idealize the Kurds. I know there's a lot of issues with that, as I tried to mention with the unfurling of Öcalan's portrait. But I think that is an important question if you want to think about these movements in relationship to internationally, and not just the Arab Spring. And you can put with them, Gezi, Occupy, etc. And so, and particularly with the fact that they occupied spaces, that kind of urban aspect to them that was kind of very common. But I mean, I do not have an answer. I think partly what is perhaps easier is some shared histories, but that would also be shared with the Ottomans. So that is a reason to put them, to bring Gezi into the question. So I do not have an answer for you, but I just wanted to say that.
But Soha, you were going to address that.
No. Nice of you, Bernard.
I saw that right there.
Yeah.
Okay.
No. Yeah, I wanted to peripherally answer this by, not only referring to Gezi, but also to Iran, 2009, the Green Revolution. And that was an example of social media, digital social media. That was perhaps one of the earliest examples of use of Twitter, and internationally as well, for everyone to change their location to Tehran, asking everyone around the world to change their location to Tehran so that the regime cannot target people on Twitter, right? So that the regime cannot target people there. That, I don't have an answer to what is the Arab in all of this, and the changing the boundaries in order to include similar movements that may have or movements that may have some similarities and differences, or some connections to what is happening in the Arab countries, or what's now known as the Arab Spring, right? But I think it's a question that's worth asking ourselves all the time. I don't think that I can't claim an expertise on everything Arab in order to speak about, a singular phenomenon called the Arab Spring. I think that it's important for us to, yes, we may engage in comparative studies and, similar inquiries, but I think that it's important for us to have the humility to think about those different phenomena as different phenomena that happened around the same time, that influenced one another, but as singularly different phenomena. What can we learn? There was this question about the demands and whether we're imposing our ideas about revolutions on what was happening in the Arab Spring as like just necessarily, revolutions meaning something, movements that need to have a social emancipatory message. Going back to the Egyptian revolution again, and I'm trying to model what I'm asking everyone to do by focusing on what I think is my area of expertise. The revolutionaries who took to the street in January 2011 called for bread, freedom,
social justice, and human dignity. Those were the 4 demands. Yes, they called also for the downfall of the regime, and they called for Mubarak to leave, right? And so there's this point about, which I like very much, this idea of like the displacement of the occupants of power. But I think that in addition to that, there were specific demands. By January 28th, 2011, one of the tallest buildings in Tahrir Square had a huge banner on it, the length of the entire building, with the specific demands of enumerated of the occupants of Tahrir Square, which were political demands and economic demands. And so that were clearly, focusing on some form of social and economic and political emancipation as well. What can we learn and what's happening now? I want to kind of like touch on that very briefly. There's a lot that can be learned. I'm not going to dwell on this idea of like the military and its role, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the revolutionaries, those people who became known as the revolutionary youth, for instance, in Egypt, who were considered the most important, like persons of the year by Time magazine or what have you, the protesters, right? Who were political in their demands, and who, for many of them, I think one major fatal flaw, was a certain romanticization of the revolutionary moment of the occupation of Tahrir Square, a certain fetishization, if you will, of the life of the square. One choir group in Egypt that was formed after the uprising of 2011 had a famous song that was basically echoing a chant that became common in the months after January, February 2011, which is, "The people want the life of the square." It became a chant. And the cognitive dissonance, if you will, between what the revolutionaries romanticized and fetishized as this ephemeral, fleeting, liminal moment, right, of the square, and what the majority of the populace started to feel, with the shutdown of the economy, basically, with no economic opportunities, no tourism, a state of quasi-lawlessness with the withdrawal of security forces, etc. That cognitive dissonance led to a huge problem, I think. And that's why I feel like it's unfair to just talk about, lack of ideology as the problem, or the horizontalization of the movement as the problem, or the anarchism of the movement. I think the problem is more profound than this, and it has to do with the fact that those were people who grew up in a foreclosed political system, right? A foreclosed political sphere, where there was no room for action whatsoever, no experience of organizing, of working together politically, of gaining a sense of what the people want, really. The people did not want the life of the square. The life of the square was a fleeting moment, and it had to be that, but that did not register. What's happening now? Despair and 60,000 people in prison in Egypt.
Well, let's not end there.
I think it's mostly been said, and what I heard also in the comments by the 6 individuals was really just thought-provoking ideas, and less in the form of questions. I mean, I'm not sure on the army thing, for example, what can be added to that, except to say, and I think Soha is right. Each country is sort of has its unique specificities, and it's difficult to sort of claim knowledge about all of them. I mean, in the case of Tunisia, it was a small army, an army that had been marginalized, especially by Ben Ali. Ben Ali did not trust it, and they did not trust him. So it was not difficult for the army to side with the people, and ultimately it was the Chief of Staff, Rashid Ammar, who basically went to the presidential palace on January 14 and said, "You must leave. I will not protect you, and I will not be responsible for you." I think, to Rosalind's point, that's an interesting way to look at it. That it was perhaps not as much of a revolution. It was sort of a reclamation, perhaps, or a restoration of certain ideals, but it was also a revolution. It was asking for the displacement of the occupants of power, and it was a revolution that was, driven by a desire for, less in the case of perhaps, social as much as it was economic emancipation, because even under Ben Ali and certainly under Bourguiba, the social structure, I think, in Tunisia and the ability to practice certain freedoms, it was a different dynamic altogether, which helped it, after the revolution. I mean, in my visits, for example, to Cairo, between January 2011 and July 2013, it was really it was fascinating, to sort of observe the revolutionaries and the attempts at bringing maturity to the process. Finally, I couldn't agree with you more, Etienne. I think, it is a homogenizing term that is homogenizing something that is totally heterogeneous. My problem with Arab Spring is with each of the two words. Yeah, you do? Good. I hope so.
Not in a good way. So interesting. Okay, can I very briefly? Egyptians in the beginning, in the 10 days between the end of the Tunisian, or not the end, but the ouster of Ben Ali and the start of the Egyptian uprising, the elites kept talking about how Egypt is not Tunisia, Egypt is not Tunisia, Egypt is not Tunisia, in a way of to dismiss the possibility of this happening in Egypt. And some of the even revolutionaries started saying, okay, but let's not get our hopes that high because Egypt is not Tunisia. And then after the Egyptian uprising and the ouster of Mubarak and the start of the uprisings in Libya and Syria, the Egyptian state started talking about the importance of consolidating its authority again in order not to become Syria or Libya or Iraq sometimes. And so this idea of finding a singularity in this whole wave that is taking the region by storm has been paramount in the thinking about, oh, no, we're different. Don't talk about the Arab Spring because we're not that. We're not part of it, and we don't want to be swept up.
Okay, so actually, this is the point at which I usually should turn over the mic to our guests so that they can do the wrap-up. But it feels as if we got a little bit inverted. So here's what I propose very quickly: a few more comments, but kind of quick comments, and maybe we can turn our questions into actually comments. So of course, I just want to make two before giving over to Musab. First, the one question is whether you win over Jim, whether you win over the forces of repression, or that notion of you winning them to your side. I think more likely is they decide what is to their advantage or not in terms of intervening, and it's not it's very slim chances of winning over. It's more what's in their interest and whether or not it aligns for a brief moment. Second thing, in response to the someone was talking about SF Bayat's question of ideology. I think it was you, Soha. I was stunned in that chapter to the extent to which actually Michel Foucault apparently is responsible for the lack of ideology in the Arab world. So that kind of threw me off my chair. But it's there. Okay, third. So next is Musab. I have to say that this is an important moment because when we were litigating Musab's case, I don't know, you're going to get a short little law lesson right now. The basic claim of kind of the fact that the Muslim ban is violating kind of the First Amendment Establishment Clause, right, is something for which actually Musab didn't have standing, okay? So he couldn't raise that claim. So the only claim that we could actually conceptualize was that we, in this room, had a First Amendment speech right to hear Musab, right? In other words, so that his presence was something that was benefiting us and our First Amendment rights. So you don't know how important it is that I turn the mic over to Musab.
It's just a brief comment, really. So there's been a lot of emphasis on the role of social media. So I wanted to just draw the attention to the role of the traditional media. So as many of you may know, there's the first pan-Arab channel was Al Jazeera in the early 90s. It was established. So prior to that, you had censored state channels, which just portrayed boring national images. So Al Jazeera was probably the first channel which essentially portrayed images and ideas in Arab countries, obviously, which wasn't under the... So these images weren't under the control, they weren't able to censor these images in these states. So I'm not sure, especially particularly in the Libyan example, during the revolution, the level of internet penetration was probably quite low prior to the revolution. And I was actually there just prior to that, in December of 2010. So the Tunisian uprisings or revolution had just started taking place then. So I just recall family and friends just crowded around television, watching these images from Al Jazeera. And also just to tie in with the comment of the mathematician at the back, who asked about the role of potentially the Intifada and how that may have affected, or how it might have helped these revolutions take place. I would say, to an extent, yes. With channels like Al Jazeera, it portrayed images of, as opposed to Western media, it's probably a lot less censored. So you had all these violent images during the Intifada, during the Iraq War. So I would say, to an extent, it probably desensitized some of these populations, and probably made things, I suppose, easier to accept that route. And especially nowadays, with the bipolar distribution of this media, so you have the rival channel Al Arabiya, so Al Jazeera is based in Qatar, Al Arabiya in Saudi Arabia, and these are often on opposing sides of these the ongoing situation. And just to drive home that point, I suppose with the recent Qatar and GCC rift, that was one of the preconditions to close down Al Jazeera, obviously. They haven't, I suppose, attempted to shut down social media or anything like that, but I suppose that emphasizes the importance of the traditional media, because everybody has access to traditional media, everyone has a television, as opposed to social media, which hasn't penetrated the whole population, I suppose.
That is an interesting question. I'd actually like to hear more about that too. But sorry, my question goes back a little bit to the discussion in the first session about revolution and counter-revolution, the Allah Koselleck and the very concept of revolution. Because there does seem to be a presupposition, and I'm interested to know whether, to the degree to which this actually holds historically here, that revolutions, to the extent that they revolve, that they literally turn, that there's a turning, that it's a turning left. And I take Fayette's, the much-cited Fayette's main point to be that, in this case, the prior revolution, or these many cases in different forms, including the Tunisian one, the prior revolution is the neoliberal one. In its heterogeneity, its contradictions, including the availability of liberal media, corporate media of various kinds. And so whether it's Facebook or state-sponsored mass media. So I'm interested, to the extent that we can recharacterize these movements in relation to a prior neoliberal project, how the question of revolution fares, essentially.
Yes, my question in some ways dovetails with yours. I wanted to push further on this question of technology and authority and see if maybe we can bring in some Arendt here. I'm a little bit of a Luddite. When I think about technology and modes of communication, I often think of Socrates' story about the Egyptian god Thoth, and how the moral of the story is that writing itself as a mode of communication and storing information actually in some ways alienates people from their own sort of self-knowledge and storing knowledge and a sense of culture within oneself. And there's something interesting there. I think in Foucault's writing on heterotopia, where he talks about networks of space, and even in Arendt's essay on what is authority that we read for today, as well as her essay on outer space, she talks about technology and technological conditions and alienation. And I'm curious if you can speak more about the relationship between Arendt and authority, and what are the other ways in which technologies of communication influence revolution. I know Jesus had a great blog post for Mao on Mao's Little Red Book and the production and distribution of the book, but that distribution is also a production. It's some ways capitalist as well. And I think the last thing I'll say is Richard Bullitt has a very interesting essay on modes of communication and technology in the Islamic legal tradition, and how that in many ways modern technology has, in his argument, has eroded traditional institutional means of ensuring authority within the Islamic legal tradition. I'm curious how all of this plays into this conversation. Thanks.
I'd like to build on that. Do you see a role for a critical Islamic theory playing and a mobilization, a grassroots mobilization of Muslims in Western democracies to play in reframing and renaming the Arab Spring, let's say, alt-radical Muslim movement or whatever? Do you see a role for a questioning of the narratives coming out of Saudi Arabia and Tehran that would be useful to help mobilize not only in predominantly Muslim nations, but in Western democracies at all, to redefine the issues? For example, one thing that I would say is where you have, considering the oppressive regime you have in Saudi Arabia and the fact that the Prophet Muhammad never made Hajj until after he was in control of Saudi Arabia, perhaps we would not go to Saudi Arabia until they modify their regime. I mean, calling for that type of radical action.
Thanks. All right, very quickly.
Hi. I see a parallel, when you're talking about the Arab Spring, I see a parallel between the Arab countries with the Eastern Bloc, the fall of communism in the Eastern Bloc. It was sort of the same narrative, the United States primarily, and against communism, and so sort of interfering in that region to bring democracy. So there are similarities and historical events to refer to. And so with that, I wanted to think, I thought about the interference. Can we think about revolutions independent of international interference? And I think we can't think of interference only when, in the case of when Clinton interfered the UN interfered in Yugoslavia. What are the ways that the international forces interfere? Are they through secret organizations? Are they through NGOs or through arms sales? At what point do we refer to the international interference? And I think at this point, maybe where we are now, more pressing is the question of democracy. What are the means of promotion of democracy, and what is the effect in the Arab Spring at this point, or even maybe in other regions?
Thank you.
Thank you. No, it's going to be more than a second, but it'll be brief. I want to take it back to the conceptual content of revolution, I think, which somehow what we started with. And what I found very interesting in your talk, Soha, is this image of the doctor, this figure of the doctor, brought, at least to my mind, the question of the historical subject, or what the subject of revolution, who the subject of revolution today in a place like Tahrir is. And one of the very symptomatic things I think about Tahrir is that it had so many, in figural terms, so many subjects. The workers at Mahalla were a sort of figure for a while. The social media activists, as you say, were the figure for a while. The ultra football fans were the figure of the time. Of course, what's noteworthy about all of these figurations is none of them are the masses, none of them are the plebs, none of them stand in for the majority in a way that the figure of the proletarian would have once upon a time. So I wonder, is a historical subject something we still need to be thinking through? And in that sense, I'm not sure how the move to Bayat's non-movements and the kind of passive network brings that back, because, I mean, contra to Bayat's statement that he was being prescient and predicting. Okay, well, I'll leave it. But I have something. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Okay. But I have one more, and I've been waiting from the very beginning, and I'm going to be a hog because I have to ask a question to Nada because she made such clear remarks. And I think by the same token, in Nada, your talk, what you began with, that we need to move beyond a certain evaluative judgment of revolution. Revolution used as a kind of evaluative modality. This is revolution, this is not revolution, which in a way makes it immune from the very phenomenon it seeks to analyze or describe. This is a critique that's been made in many places, but if we stick with that, you yourself, in invoking the Syrian opposition as revolutionaries continuously, are making a similar kind of normative judgment. In which case, this is the question, is a revolution in a scenario like this simply a formal concept? That is, it doesn't have the content that Reinhold talked about a second ago, that it turns left, or that it does have a content, that it's a turning left. And because I think to say that anti-imperialists oppose the Syrian opposition out of a visceral, sentimental, knee-jerk reaction is hugely simplistic and utterly brutal. In fact, what they oppose it on in the terms is that this does not have a content that is a recognizably revolutionary, given their concepts of revolution.
Good. Okay.
And
Thank you. Good. No, that's not. Okay. So the conversation is going to continue, obviously, because we're coming to the end. But obviously, the conversation is going to continue all night. I've got 30 seconds, literally.
So Professor Masri's list of Tunisian anomalies was included Tunisia's distance from the Arab-Israeli conflict, except of course by it being the headquarters of the PLO after the invasion of Lebanon. And I appreciate the conversation about the Intifada, but I was wondering whether you could explain the role that plays in the other locations. My sense is that it wasn't really specifically about the PLO, but in the Egyptian context, probably the Camp David Accords, and how it plays in the other spots too. How'd I do?
Okay, damn well. Very good. So we're getting close to being out of time. Maybe a real kind of one synthetic thought to kind of lead us into the next, to one minor, is it possible? You kind of defend yourself. Okay, so can you do it fast?
Yeah, I just want to say, I did mention the fact that Rojava, etc., plays on what we think is progressive, and that's why there's no problem with Rojava. That's what I said, and I do have a problem with that. That's what I'm saying. There's also a reason why, I mean, the Iranian Revolution is called a revolution, and even though it didn't turn right, didn't turn left, sorry, according to a lot, but it didn't turn, the right way for some others that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just address the last question. I mean, I think we'd love to talk to you some more about that, but basically what I was trying to say is that you had a combination of things. You had a Tunisian identity that, as I said, it was not ever exclusively Arab or Muslim, but really an amalgamation of a lot of influences. And Habib Bourguiba decidedly took Tunisia into sort of a Mediterranean identity direction, right? And his foreign policy reflected that. So from the beginning, he declared, and he actually published an editorial piece in the New York Times, declaring Tunisia being with the West, right? So there was never sort of, shift back and displaying sort of, both the United States and the Soviet Union. Was decidedly pro-Western. The relationship with Jamal Abdel Nasser was always acrimonious. And the relationship with the Arab League of Nations was somewhat ambivalent. And again, there are many, many layers to this, of course, and many factors associated with this. But he did not want to play a role in any of that, and he, joined war efforts when he really had to. I mean, in one war effort, and I think it was 1973, he had the army sort of parade around Tunisia for a long period of time to sort of be prepared to be shipped to the war, so that by the time they were prepared to be shipped to the war was over. So that's part of what I mean, by sort of, keeping that distance.
Great. And Soha, you got a small last thought?
20-second thought. I was really, I thought it was really intriguing, that notion that you raise about who's the subject of the revolution. And unfortunately, I think that the subject has been that nebulous protester, right? The Times Person of the Year, who was clearly classed, gendered, aged, fashioned in a certain way. But I argue, I think, that it's only if we nuance that image of the subject of the protester to contain the football ultra, the doctor, the garbage collector, the worker, et cetera, the women who are working on the street doing many things. It's only then that we would be capable not only of having a better understanding of what happened, but maybe of salvaging whatever remains of this exceptional moment and push it towards more productive ends, hopefully.
All right, that was a good last thought. Actually, it ties to a conference we're going to have in Paris in December, on December 19th, at the Global Center on subjectivity and revolution. Right, so that's a nice segue. That'll be a nice connection. Okay, all right. Well, I want to thank our extraordinary speakers. Thank you so much. And thank you all for all your great questions and your patience with the mic. Thank you.